Doug Ford couldn't escape the fallout. He had gambled everything and lost, and now the entire province of Ontario was paying the price. The so-called tough guy act that Ford tried to pull off against Trump had left him with nowhere to hide. It wasn't just his own political career that was at stake, it was the livelihoods of millions of Canadians. And while Ford was trying to put on a brave face, the cracks were showing, and they were showing fast. The repercussions of his bluff were more than just economic, they were personal too. Business leaders across Canada were livid. "Ford has pushed us into a disaster," one anonymous executive from Bombardier remarked, his voice thick with frustration. The company, a key pillar of Ontario's manufacturing sector, was considering pulling out. They couldn't afford to keep their operations there if Ford kept up with the antics that had already cost them so much. The Toronto Stock Exchange plunged 5%, and as the numbers dropped, so did Ford's approval. This wasn't just about energy or tariffs. It was about his failure to understand the real power dynamics. Ford had underestimated Trump, and now he was paying for it in front of the world. As the public outcry swelled, more and more Canadians began to turn their backs on him. Pierre Poilievre, a prominent figure in the Conservative Party, didn't hold back. On social media, he blasted Ford, calling him the man who dishonored the nation. "Ford should resign," he tweeted, his message spreading like wildfire. The backlash wasn't limited to the politicians or business leaders. 60% of Ontario's population, according to a hypothetical poll, demanded Ford apologize to Trump to restore some dignity to a government now seen as feckless and weak. Ford's fate was sealed, and yet he couldn't admit it. He kept on trying to save face, pretending like he had some sort of strategy left, but it was all just for show. When Ford finally appeared before the media, his body language screamed defeat, his shoulders sagging as if he were already a defeated man. "We didn't want a trade war," he said, his voice a mere whisper. It was clear that the man who had once threatened to fight fire with fire was now pleading for a way out. The press conference was a spectacle of despair, a man too proud to admit his mistakes, yet too weak to stand his ground. Then came the inevitable. Just hours after his public admission of defeat, Ford made the ultimate compromise. "We will suspend the electricity tariff for now," he muttered, essentially handing Trump the win. The cameras flashed as the world watched the spectacle unfold. But it wasn't Ford's face that lingered in the minds of viewers. It was Trump's quiet victory, delivered without lifting a finger, just by the sheer weight of his will. And still, Trump didn't let up. He used Ford's collapse as a way to further cement his narrative that anyone who challenged him would fail. He had learned long ago that being strong meant not having to prove anything. Trump had become the king of the geopolitical chessboard. With Canada now a pawn he had crushed effortlessly. Trump's words on Truth Social were short, sharp, and biting, just like his entire approach. Canada thought they could play hardball. It's shameful. He knew it wasn't just about Ford or even Canada anymore. It was about sending a message to the rest of the world. Don't mess with America, or you'll end up like Canada. But this wasn't over. Trump's victory over Ford was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that was unfolding in real time. If Ford's fall was any indication, Canada was only the first in a long line of nations about to face Trump's wrath. And Ford? He was left holding the bag, a man broken by his own hubris, watching as his people turned against him. But the questions lingered. Would Trump stop with Canada? Or was this just the beginning of his global dominance? Doug Ford couldn't escape the fallout. He had gambled everything and lost. And now the people of Canada were turning their backs on him. The so-called tough guy act that Ford tried to pull off against Trump had left him with nowhere to hide. It wasn't just his own political career that was at stake. It was the livelihoods of millions of Canadians. And while Ford was trying to put on a brave face, the cracks were showing, and they were showing fast. The repercussions of his bluff were more than just economic. They were personal too. Business leaders across Canada were livid. "Ford has pushed us into a disaster," one anonymous executive from Bombardier remarked, his voice thick with frustration. The company, a key pillar of Ontario's manufacturing sector, was considering pulling out. They couldn't afford to keep their operations there if Ford kept up with the antics that had already cost them so much. The Toronto Stock Exchange plunged 5%, and as the numbers dropped, so did Ford's approval. This wasn't just about energy or tariffs, it was about his failure to understand the real power dynamics. Ford had underestimated Trump, and now he was paying for it in front of the world. As the public outcry swelled, more and more Canadians began to turn their backs on him. Pierre Poilievre, a prominent figure in the Conservative Party, didn't hold back. On social media, he blasted Ford, calling him the man who dishonored the nation. Ford should resign, he tweeted, his message spreading like wildfire. The backlash wasn't limited to the politicians or business leaders. 60% of Ontario's population, according to a hypothetical poll, demanded Ford apologize to Trump to restore some dignity to a government now seen as feckless and weak. Ford's fate was sealed, and yet he couldn't admit it. He kept on trying to save face, pretending like he had some sort of strategy left, but it was all just for show. When Ford finally appeared before the media, his body language screamed defeat, his shoulders sagging as if he were already a defeated man. "We didn't want this," he said, his voice a mere whisper. It was clear that the man who had once threatened to fight fire with fire was now a shadow of his former self. The press conference was a spectacle of despair, a man too proud to admit his mistakes, yet too weak to stand his ground. Trump used Ford's collapse as a way to further cement his narrative that anyone who challenged him would fail. He had learned long ago that being strong meant not having to prove anything. Trump had become the king of the geopolitical chessboard. With Canada now a pawn he had crushed effortlessly, his words on Truth Social were short, sharp, and biting. Canada thought they could play hardball. It's shameful. Ford has lost everything. But will Trump let him off the hook? The question lingered as Canada reeled from the blow. The left was screaming, "Trump is a threat," but no one could stop him, not even Canada's allies. Headlines blared across every major network. Trump's victory over Canada, a political humiliation. And yet, amid the chaos, there was one glaring issue. Despite the uproar, despite the media frenzy and the attacks from the left, nothing was actually changing. The more the left screamed, the stronger Trump's grip became. They didn't know it yet, but their desperate cries were merely amplifying the inevitable. Trump was winning. In Canada, the left-wing media, led by outlets like CBC, couldn't help but lash out. "Trump is destroying Canada," one headline screamed, as if this was the end of the world. But the reality was much simpler, much harder to swallow for those who opposed him. Trump had merely done what any powerful leader would. He'd played the game of economics better than anyone else. His tactics were harsh but effective. 80% of Canada's exports flowed south to the US, a fact the left couldn't deny. On social media, the left did what they do best. They fumed. "Trump is a threat to democracy," they declared, but this time, their words were empty. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have a solution, just condemnation. And as they ranted and raved, they ignored the most glaring truth. Trump wasn't going anywhere. Even Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, wasn't immune to the pressure. In an attempt to salvage some dignity for his nation, Trudeau had tried to rally support from Europe, hoping for some form of unity. "We need help," he'd said in desperation. "Help us counter these tariffs. Let's hit back." It was clear he was grasping at straws, reaching out to the European Union, expecting them to join the fight. But the answer from the EU came quickly, and it was cold. "We don't want to end up like Canada." Trudeau's failure to secure any meaningful backup from Europe was a crushing blow, not just for Canada, but for the leftist narrative. The EU, the supposed champions of multilateralism, had turned their backs on Canada in favor of self-preservation. The realization was stark. The left could shout all they wanted, but when it came down to it, Trump was the one holding the cards. Trump, ever the strategist, took full advantage of the situation. On Truth Social, his response to the leftist backlash was precise and to the point. "The left is a bunch of hypocrites. They'll lose, and I'll keep winning." If even the EU won't save Canada, could Trump truly control the global economy? The question lingered as the left flailed, powerless to stop him. By the time Doug Ford finally crawled to Washington, the damage was irreversible. The battle that started with a show of bravado had turned into a full-scale capitulation. Ford's bluff had failed spectacularly, and now he was forced to negotiate in a place where Trump held all the cards. He had no choice but to bow to the inevitable. His pride was gone, his reputation shattered. The once proud Premier of Ontario, who had declared he wouldn't back down, now sat across from Trump's negotiators, hoping for mercy. In Washington, the stakes were clear. Trump wasn't just interested in cutting deals. He was using Ford's defeat as a message to the world. The question hanging over the meeting wasn't whether Ford would cave. It was how far Trump could push before Ford cracked. And Ford was already cracked, reduced to a man trying to save whatever shred of dignity was left for his province. "We can't afford to lose anymore," Ford muttered, glancing nervously at the table, trying to gather his thoughts. Trump, however, had no intention of easing up. Trump's demands were simple: cut the steel tariffs by 10% or I won't back down. It wasn't just about the steel or the aluminum. It was about sending a message. No one, not even an entire country, could stand in his way. The reality was brutal. 80% of Canada's exports depended on the U.S. The threat was simple, but devastating. Without the U.S., Canada's economy would collapse. Trump knew it, Ford knew it, and the world knew it. The meeting dragged on. Every time Ford thought he had a point to make, Trump countered it with something more forceful. General Motors had already warned Ford that their investment in Canada was at risk. A rift was growing, and Ford, with no leverage left, was left to watch as Trump played him like a chess piece. Ford agreed to the tariff cuts, but it wasn't enough. Trump wasn't done with him yet. "They want to do business with America?" Trump's voice boomed through the room. "Then they need to play by my rules." The U.S. was in control, and Ford had no choice but to agree to terms that were written in Washington, not Ottawa. Every moment that passed was another moment that Ford's grip on his leadership slipped further. The situation was spiraling, and Trump knew exactly how to tighten the noose. Ford's position had become more than just political. It was a warning to every leader on the world stage. "Canada needs us more than we need them," Trump had said, leaning back in his chair, his expression steely. "If they don't play along, we'll just keep tightening the screws." Ford had nothing left to argue. The realization hit him hard. He couldn't afford to lose U.S. trade, and without Trump's approval, Ontario's economy would continue to freefall. The pressure was unbearable. The business world, his own people, and now his government were all watching his every move. He had no more moves left, but Trump wasn't finished. "I'll give them a break for now," Trump muttered, but the implication was clear. Ford was on borrowed time. This wasn't just about tariffs, it was about control. The U.S. was now calling the shots in global trade, and Canada's fate was entirely in Trump's hands. The world could see it, the markets could feel it, and the people of Canada knew it. Their country had lost its autonomy. The final blow came soon after. Ford reluctantly signed the New Deal, agreeing to reduce tariffs on steel and aluminum by 15%. But as soon as the deal was inked, Trump was already setting his sights on the next challenge. "Canada has learned a tough lesson," Trump tweeted immediately afterward, using his platform to cement the victory. His words sent a shockwave across the global stage. If Canada could be bent so easily, what chance did any other country have? And with that, Trump had not only crushed a leader's resolve, but he had made a statement. This was the new world order, and everyone would play by America's rules. The global economy had just been reshaped, and Canada was its first casualty. Would other nations dare to challenge Trump's power? Or would they, like Ford, bend to the will of the U.S., afraid to face the consequences of defiance? The lesson was clear. Those who resisted Trump did so at their peril. As the dust settled in Canada, Trump moved on, with one nation already in line and the rest watching in trepidation. His dominance was secured, and the world's political and economic landscape was his to control. Across the globe, whispers began to spread, a ripple of fear that was slowly turning into a wave. Canada's collapse was just the beginning of a much larger strategy. The word on the streets, in boardrooms, and in political circles was simple. Trump wasn't just a man of power, he was a man of tactics, and no one was safe from his calculated moves. His dominance over Ford was the opening act of a broader plan to reshape the world's economic order. The mere thought of it sent chills down the spines of leaders everywhere. In the weeks following Ford's humiliation, Trump had already begun to pivot, using his victory to pressure other countries into submission. Trump wasn't just dealing with Canada, he was using them as an example. His calculated moves weren't only about tariffs and trade deals, they were a warning to every nation that thought it could challenge him. Trump's influence was extending beyond just North America, and now he was eyeing Mexico as his next target. As news spread of Trump's triumph, his rivals, particularly in Mexico, began to feel the heat. The Mexican government, already under pressure due to the growing tension over immigration, found themselves caught in the crosshairs of Trump's next move. It wasn't long before Mexico's Minister of Trade made an unannounced visit to Washington. The meeting was quiet, but the message was loud and clear. Mexico had to play by Trump's rules or face the consequences. Trump's actions weren't subtle. He wasn't just applying tariffs on specific goods. He was using Canada's collapse as a preemptive strike. He didn't need to engage in lengthy negotiations. His victory over Ford had already set the tone for the world's economic future. As Mexico's Minister of Trade arrived, there was no room for diplomacy in Trump's mind, only submission. Trump made it clear in his usual blunt style, "If you don't want to end up like Canada, you need to play by my rules." His words sent a shockwave through Mexico's corridors of power. Trump had used his previous win to set the stage for this moment. The Mexican government, already on edge from Trump's previous threats, now found themselves in an impossible position. They could either comply and play nice with the U.S. or face the full wrath of Trump's trade wars. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Trump's base was riled up and behind him more than ever. Michigan, a key swing state, was in his corner. The residents, deeply invested in the outcome of these international standoffs, were vocal in their support for the president. "Trump's protecting our jobs and economy," they said. They weren't worried about Canada's fall. They saw it as just a necessary step to protect American interests. Their loyalty was clear. America First was more than just a slogan. It was now the global economic reality. Trump didn't need to speak in lengthy speeches or hold grand summits to make his point. His message was clear, concise, and above all, powerful. "Anyone who doesn't play along will pay the price," Trump declared on Truth Social, his words reverberating across the globe. Mexico now had to decide, accept the terms or face the wrath of the same pressure that had shattered Ford. The shift in the global balance of power was unmistakable. Trump wasn't just a U.S. president anymore. He was a figurehead of a new world order. Every country now had to reckon with his economic strategies. Even nations like Mexico, long seen as too important to be dominated by a single leader, now had to weigh the cost of defying the U.S. And yet, the world wasn't sitting idly by. Behind the scenes, whispers began to circulate. Could Europe, could China, find a way to unite against Trump? Could there be a force that could actually stand up to him? The political calculus was changing by the day. Every move Trump made sent shockwaves through the markets, through governments, through the very structure of the global economy. But for now, the playing field was tilted firmly in Trump's direction. In the quiet offices of world leaders, the question was no longer, if Trump wins, what happens next? It was, how can we stop this from going any further? But by now, the answer was becoming clear. The only way to avoid the next blow from Trump was to join him. So as Trump stood victorious in his latest game of high-stakes chess, the world was on edge, unsure of who would challenge him next. Canada had bowed out. Mexico was scrambling to make deals, and the rest of the world watched closely, knowing they could either align with Trump or risk becoming his next target. The global game had changed forever, and Trump was firmly in control. His next move was anyone's guess, but it was certain that no one would be safe. Not now, not ever again. "If you think you can beat me," Trump had warned, "just ask Doug Ford how that works out." Doug Ford had played his hand, but in the end, it was clear. Trump was holding all the cards. As the dust settled from the public spectacle of Ford's humiliating surrender, a chilling reality began to set in. Ford's concessions weren't enough. The damage was done, but Trump wasn't satisfied. The agreement to reduce steel tariffs by 10% was just the beginning, but Trump's tone suggested that he was already eyeing the next stage of his plan. Ford's fragile victory couldn't shield Canada from the true cost of defiance. Trump wasn't just negotiating for trade advantages. He was crafting an ultimatum that would shape the global economic landscape. In the days following the deal, Ford tried to regain some ground. He went to the press, putting on his best face, insisting that the situation had been resolved and that Canada had been protected from the worst. But the truth was clear to everyone watching. The terms of the deal were not in Ford's favor, nor were they in Canada's favor. Canada had been cornered, forced to make concessions on the terms that Trump dictated, and the impact was only beginning to unfold. As the weeks passed, Canada's economy began to show signs of strain. The stock market, still reeling from the original fallout, never quite recovered. The businesses that had once flourished now had to grapple with new tariffs, increasing uncertainty, and a growing realization that they were at the mercy of Trump's decisions. Major corporations like Stelco and Bombardier, who had already been on the edge, began to warn that more layoffs were inevitable. Jobs were disappearing, and with them, any hope of maintaining the economic independence that Canada had once prided itself on. The people of Canada were starting to feel the pressure too. Protests broke out in major cities, with citizens demanding action from their government. "We didn't sign up for this," one protester shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "Ford has sold us out." The chants were a testament to the frustration and helplessness spreading throughout the country. But Ford, now deeply entrenched in his own political survival, had little left to offer. His attempts to rally support seemed weak, and every promise he made was met with the cold reality that the true power lay across the border. Trump, however, didn't back off. He didn't need to. His victory had been total, but he knew that Canada's submission was just the beginning. His approach had always been one of relentless pressure, but now he had something more powerful: leverage. As Trump continued to make his presence felt, he used his platform to ensure that no one forgot his dominance. On Truth Social, his message was clear, sharp, and unapologetic. "Canada thought they could play tough, but they've learned their lesson," he tweeted. The world was watching, and Canada had become a cautionary tale of what happened to those who dared defy him. The pressure from Trump was unrelenting, and Ford, caught between his broken promises and the needs of his people, found himself backed into an ever-tightening corner. "We're going to need more," Trump hinted, his tone calculating. He wasn't done with Canada yet. The latest agreement had barely cooled, and Trump was already looking for further concessions. "Reducing tariffs isn't enough," he said bluntly. Ford, weakened by the weight of his failure, knew what was coming next, but there was little he could do. His political capital was spent, and the country had little choice but to comply. At the same time, the U.S. was quietly pushing its economic advantages onto other nations. With the Canadian economy reeling and Ford's government hanging by a thread, Trump's influence spread across borders. The diplomatic landscape was shifting, and the message was unmistakable. Trump had positioned himself as the gatekeeper of global trade. Any country that wanted to do business with the U.S. had to play by his rules. But the real tragedy for Canada was the growing realization that they had been left with no leverage. The political landscape had shifted, and in the process, Canada's autonomy had been erased. The country that had once prided itself on strong trade ties with its neighbor was now locked into a system where every decision was made in Washington. Ford's handling of the crisis had failed. He was unable to regain the trust of his people or his business leaders, and the political fallout only deepened. The damage wasn't just economic, it was national. As Canada struggled to recover, one question lingered in the minds of its citizens. Had their sovereignty been permanently compromised? And the more they watched Trump continue to flex his power over their economy, the more the answer seemed to be yes. While Ford tried to cling to any semblance of control, Trump continued to tighten his grip. With each passing day, it became more and more clear that Canada was caught in a geopolitical vice, a vice that Trump controlled with expert precision. The country had become a case study in the consequences of challenging the U.S. No one could ignore it. Canada was paying the price, and the rest of the world was taking notes. For the people of Canada, there was no easy escape. Their country had been forced to surrender its economic sovereignty, and the aftermath was a slow, painful unraveling. Ford, once seen as a political force in Ontario, had become a symbol of failure, and Trump, standing tall on his victory, was setting his sights on his next move. A move that would continue to redefine global politics, one country at a time. As for Canada, the question remained, would they ever regain control, or had they become another cautionary tale in Trump's grand strategy? Only time would tell. The cries from the left were deafening, but they were growing more desperate with each passing day. It wasn't just the loss of Ford's battle with Trump that stung. It was the realization that the left had been completely outplayed. Every call for resistance, every plea for solidarity among nations fell flat. As Trump moved to cement his control over Canada and, by extension, the global stage, the left found themselves not just silenced, but utterly impotent. The narrative they had fought so hard to maintain, that of a resilient, united global front, was crumbling at the edges. In Canada, the media storm continued to rage, particularly from the left-wing outlets. "Trump is destroying Canada," they screamed, casting him as a villain of epic proportions. But despite their noise, nothing changed. The CBC, which had once been the voice of opposition, was left scrambling for answers, trying to salvage some shred of credibility in the wake of their defeat. They could point to his tweets, his policies, his dangerous approach, but none of it mattered. The truth was simpler and far harder to swallow. Trump was winning, and not just in North America, but across the entire global political landscape. Frustration mounted. Trudeau, who had hoped to play the role of a statesman on the world stage, now found himself publicly floundering. He had tried to rally European support, hoping that his global allies would stand in solidarity with Canada. But what he got instead was a cold shoulder from the European Union, who, despite their usual grandstanding about unity and cooperation, were unwilling to risk challenging Trump. "We don't want to end up like Canada," came the response from Europe, cold and devoid of any empathy. Trudeau's defeat was a blow not just to him personally, but to the entire left-wing cause. It was clear that Europe, the one region where the left had hoped to find an ally against Trump's America, was unwilling to make the stand. The EU wasn't about to sacrifice its economic relationship with the US for the sake of Canada. In the world of politics, pragmatism had triumphed over ideals, and the left had been left behind. Trump was not just a US president anymore. He was a global force, and the European Union had bent the knee to his demands too. Even as the left screamed and demanded action, there was no real response, no countermeasure. The outpouring of anger from Canadian progressives was met with the same relentless indifference that Trump had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. His strategy, his total domination, left no room for their voice to echo in the halls of power. As Trudeau desperately tried to spin his failure, he was quickly overshadowed by the weight of Trump's victory. But what came next was perhaps the most striking part of the narrative. A challenger appeared, a leader bold enough to face Trump head-on, or so it seemed. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, stepped forward, delivering a defiant speech. "America cannot dictate the future of the world," Macron declared. He spoke of sovereignty, of Europe standing strong in the face of US aggression, even hinting at potential trade retaliations of their own. His words were sharp, filled with fire. It seemed like the left might finally find its answer. But just as quickly as Macron made his bold statement, he faltered. Within hours, a phone call from Berlin and a quiet whisper from Brussels had Macron retreating from the idea of any substantial retaliation. The European consensus was clear. No confrontation with Trump. It wasn't worth the risk. Macron's rhetoric quickly turned to appeasement, and the fire he had kindled was doused by the same leaders he had hoped would stand by him. Trump, ever the strategist, seized on this moment. He was unbothered by Macron's words. As he fired off another post on Truth Social, he mocked Europe's weakness. "The French talk a big game, but they won't back it up. They're too afraid to face the truth, just like Canada." The global left had once again been made to look foolish. They had tried to rally support. They had hoped for a united front, but they had miscalculated badly. In the battle for global dominance, Trump had already won. What was left for the left to do? Their strongest voices were muffled. Trudeau had lost credibility in the eyes of his own people, and now even Macron's brief surge of defiance had crumbled. Trump was too powerful, too determined. His every move was calculated to break his opponents, not just politically, but psychologically. The left, once a global force, was now being reduced to an impotent, ineffective faction on the world stage. Even within the US, the left was reeling. They had failed to rein in Trump, and now they had failed to protect their allies abroad. Democrats could not ignore the message any longer. Trump was in control, and anyone who stood against him would face the consequences. His victory wasn't just political, it was personal, and the consequences of defying him would be felt across generations. And yet, as the left fell further into disarray, there was one looming question that lingered. Had they learned their lesson, or would they try to stand up once more, only to fall again? The global stage was shifting, and Trump was firmly at the center, watching as his opponents floundered in the wake of his triumphs. The world had been set on a new path, and no one, not even Europe, was prepared for what came next. "You can't fight the tide," Trump had said, "and the tide is with me." The silence in Ottawa was deafening. The fight was over, the battle lost. There were no more press conferences, no more promises of defiance, no more bold declarations from Doug Ford or Justin Trudeau. Canada had been beaten, and now came the reckoning. The air of defiance that once surrounded its leadership had been replaced with quiet, begrudging submission. The country that had dared to stand against Trump was now shackled to the very rules it had tried to resist. It was official. Canada had signed the agreement. Ford, after weeks of denial and empty posturing, had finally done what everyone knew was inevitable. The New Deal slashed steel and aluminum tariffs by 15%, a figure dictated entirely by Washington, with no concessions on Trump's end. There was no compromise, no negotiated settlement. Canada had simply given in. And worse, Ford had no way to spin it. The political fallout was immediate. In Ontario, the very province Ford had sworn to protect, the reaction was pure outrage. "Traitor!" headlines screamed in major Canadian newspapers, the ink barely dry on the new agreement. The Toronto Star ran a brutal editorial calling Ford the man who sold out Canada's economic future. Bombardier, already on the brink, announced layoffs, blaming the instability of Ford's failed leadership. Stelco followed, cutting production and issuing warnings that without further government intervention, more jobs would disappear. The damage wasn't just economic, it was existential. But the people weren't just angry at Ford. They were angry at Trudeau. His government had failed to protect Canada's interests, failed to rally global support, failed to stop Trump's relentless economic assault. He had promised strength and delivered weakness. And now, for the first time, even his strongest supporters were questioning whether he could survive the next election. Meanwhile, in Washington, Trump was already moving forward. To him, Canada's submission was a minor victory in a much bigger war. He barely acknowledged the agreement, treating it as nothing more than the natural order of things, an inevitable consequence of challenging his authority. His response on Truth Social was short and direct. Canada played stupid games. They won stupid prizes. For Trump, there was no need for celebration. This was expected. His focus had already shifted elsewhere, toward bigger, more significant challenges. If Canada had been broken in just a few months, what did that say about the rest of the world? What country would dare to stand against him now? But even as Trump moved on, Canada's wounds were only beginning to fester. The consequences of Ford's collapse were far from over. The stock market remained unstable, businesses pulled back investments, and the Canadian dollar continued to slide. The nation was spiraling, caught in a vortex of uncertainty, its economy now firmly in the hands of the U.S. And Trump knew it. His silence was intentional. He didn't need to rub salt in the wound. The consequences of Canada's surrender would do that for him. The protests, the economic downturn, the political chaos, all of it served as a warning to the world. In Ottawa, Trudeau's cabinet met in private, scrambling for damage control. But the harsh truth was that there was no easy fix. Canada's economy was now more dependent on the U.S. than ever before, and there was no path forward without Trump's approval. The realization stung. Ford had not just lost a trade war, he had handed Canada's economic sovereignty over to Washington. And so, as the days passed and the news cycle moved on, Canada faded from the global stage. It was no longer the independent, proud nation that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. It was now just another country in Trump's orbit, another economy bound by his rules. But for the rest of the world, the lesson was clear. If even Canada could be forced into submission, who could possibly stand against Trump? And more importantly, who would dare to try? The world watched in stunned silence as Donald Trump's triumph over Canada unfolded into a spectacle of geopolitical supremacy. It wasn't just a victory for Trump, it was a statement that no one, not even the most powerful nations, was beyond his reach. Canada had caved. Its leaders, once proud and defiant, had now become a cautionary tale for any country considering challenging Trump's dominance. But for Trump, this wasn't just about winning against Canada. It was a demonstration of power, a message to the rest of the world. The chessboard had been set, and all the pieces were moving toward his grand design. As Ford and Trudeau tried to salvage what little remained of their fractured political credibility, Trump turned his attention elsewhere. His eyes shifted south, then across the Pacific, as he began to set his sights on new targets. Mexico, already fearful of the U.S. administration's pressure, found itself teetering on the edge. But Trump had no intention of stopping there. He had already proven that no country, no matter how big or how strong, could stand against him. Canada fell. Now we'll see how others react, Trump had declared in a private meeting with his closest advisors. The next target was already in the crosshairs: Japan. With its massive economy and deep global influence, Japan had long been a key player in international trade and diplomacy. However, the reality was clear: Japan was vulnerable. Japan's reliance on U.S. markets, its trade imbalance with the United States, and its deep military and economic ties to Washington made it a perfect candidate for Trump's next move. In a series of private negotiations, Trump's administration began laying the groundwork for a series of trade demands aimed squarely at Japan. Tariffs on cars, technology, and agricultural products, all set to increase unless Japan agreed to renegotiate the terms of their trade relationship with the U.S. The ball was now in Japan's court. The message was clear: submit or face the consequences. Behind closed doors, Japan's leadership began to panic. They had watched as Canada folded. They had seen the devastation that Ford's capitulation had wrought on their economy. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the leader of Japan, tried to remain calm, meeting with key figures in the Japanese business community, and even reaching out to European partners for support. But as the weeks went on, the realization set in: there was no one coming to their rescue. In Washington, Trump made his move. In a public speech, he revealed his demands, giving Japan a limited window of time to come to the table. If Japan wants to continue thriving with the United States, they'll need to play by our rules, Trump stated. The implications were clear. Japan's trade deals with the U.S. were now under Trump's control. The world trembled. If Japan, with all its economic power and global standing, could be brought to heel by the President of the United States, what hope did any other country have? The United Kingdom was on edge, knowing that the next round of U.S.-EU trade talks could be just as brutal. Germany, a leading power in the EU, found itself re-evaluating its relationship with the U.S. And in China, the leaders couldn't help but wonder how long they could continue challenging Trump's trade policies before they, too, were forced to relent. But Trump's play wasn't just about trade. It was about reshaping the world order to reflect his vision, to establish a new economic hegemony that was no longer governed by multilateral agreements or UN resolutions. It was a world governed by American might, where nations either complied with Trump's demands or faced economic isolation and collapse. Trump had become the world's true economic kingmaker. With every move, every tweet, every tariff, he solidified his control. And as Japan scrambled to comply, Mexico, still haunted by its own previous dealings with Trump, agreed to a secret trade deal that would see further U.S. influence expand into the country's agricultural and manufacturing sectors. The U.S. was expanding its power, and the rest of the world was reluctantly falling in line. As the global markets began to reflect the impact of Trump's economic policy, it was clear that the world had changed in a way no one had anticipated. Countries once considered impervious to pressure were now bending to his will. No country, not even the most powerful, was beyond his reach. Trump's enemies, now scattered and divided, began to realize the full extent of his power. The left, unable to mount a real challenge, had watched as their global alliances crumbled, one after another. They had failed to stop him. But the question remained, could anyone stop him? The world had learned one thing for certain. Trump's grip on power was growing stronger by the day, and there was no clear challenger in sight. As Trump looked out over his kingdom, a new era had begun. And in this new era, America was not just leading the world, it was controlling it. The world had shifted, and Trump was at the center of it all. Canada was a distant memory, its defiance swallowed up by Trump's merciless economic tactics. But this wasn't the end. Far from it. The stage had been set, and now the players were watching, waiting for their turn. Trump had changed the rules of the game, and the world was now bound by his new order. As Trump looked out at the landscape he had reshaped, his grip on the global economy had never been stronger. Canada had fallen, and now other nations, once proud, once powerful, were left with no choice but to comply. The EU had bowed out of any serious confrontation, and even Japan had knelt before his economic demands. Mexico had already signed away more of its autonomy, and Europe was quietly adjusting to a new reality. The geopolitical landscape had been remade, and in the end, Trump stood victorious. Yet there was one lingering question that haunted the corridors of power. Was this really the end? Trump's dominance in global trade was unmatched. The agreements he'd forged were not just about tariffs or steel. They were about reshaping the very structure of international relations. America was no longer a participant in global affairs. It was the reigning authority, dictating terms to anyone who wanted to play. Trump's economy was booming, the stock market continued to rise, and his policies were pushing America into an era of unrivaled prosperity. But in the midst of all this triumph, whispers began to emerge. Countries that had once been steadfast in their defiance, China, Russia, even nations in Europe, were quietly preparing for the inevitable. They were plotting, recalculating, wondering if there was any way to challenge the man who had so thoroughly dominated the world stage. In the halls of the European Union, there was talk of resistance. The leaders of Germany and France, humiliated by their inability to stop Trump's advance, had begun to discuss their own economic alliances, whether it was with China, India, or even breaking away from America's sphere of influence altogether. The global left, ever the underdog, started to regroup. There were murmurings of rebellion, a rise in populist movements that claimed to resist Trump's brand of economic imperialism. Meanwhile, Trump, ever the master of his own narrative, had already set his sights on the next phase of his campaign, one that would further consolidate his power on the global stage. America was at the apex of its strength, but Trump knew that the world's power centers had never been static. Nations would always rise, always plot against the dominant power. Trump's victory had been complete, but as he always knew, it wasn't just about being the king. It was about holding the throne. And so, as Canada's once proud leaders hung their heads in defeat, Trump moved forward with even greater ambition. He continued to speak of global dominance, the American first narrative now cemented in the annals of history. But while his foes recoiled, Trump's supporters rallied around him, cheering the dismantling of the old order. For many Americans, this was just the beginning of their newfound prominence on the world stage, a stage they had long been sidelined from. In Washington, the echoes of victory were loud. Trump stood tall, his place in history seemingly assured. He had remade not just his country, but the world, and his influence stretched across oceans. Yet in the quiet corners of the world, beneath the cheers of victory, there was an unease. For the world had learned the bitter truth. Trump had changed everything, and there was no going back. Countries once too proud to bend were now left contemplating their place in this new world. Canada's humiliation had been a warning, and Japan's compliance only reinforced the truth. To challenge Trump was to risk everything. The question remained, who would dare to defy him next? The answer, it seemed, was unclear. Some countries would comply, some would hesitate, but everyone knew one thing for sure. Trump had reshaped the global order, and whether the world liked it or not, America was back on top. "The tide is with me," Trump had said, and now, as the world watched, it was clear. He was right. The question was no longer about whether the world would accept Trump's rules, but rather how long they could survive under them. The global stage had shifted, and as for Trump, He knew that this was just one act in a much larger drama. The world had learned its lesson, but would it accept its place in his empire? The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: Trump had won.